There was a time when Vince McMahon's biggest opposition was World Championship Wrestling, and before that, the National Wrestling Alliance. However, there is a sweet spot that bridged the gap between these 2 points in history. A sweet spot that really doesn't get brought up nearly as much as it should. But we're about to change all that. Because today... This episode comes as a result of the exclusive polls over on Patreon, and speaking of which, I want to give a big thank you to all my Patreon supporters out there, like Dakari Garmin, Jess K, and The Woos. And also, brand new exclusive Patreon polls are up right now, so go ahead, sign up, and make sure that you vote. And with that out the way, let's get into the episode. Jim Crockett Promotions was founded by... Jim Crockett. No real surprise there. And also, he was a promoter, I guess, also no real big surprise there. But what some of you may not know is that he also promoted other shows like concerts and theater, as well as other sports like baseball and hockey. And furthermore, what some of you might find interesting is despite the name of the company clearly reflecting the name of its founder, the company wasn't always named that, at least not all the time. In 1931, Jim Crockett started his wrestling organization as a regional company for the Carolinas and Virginia. Now, it was officially named after him, but unofficially it ran under many different names from time to time, with names such as Mid-Atlantic Wrestling, East Coast Wrestling, Championship Wrestling, All-Star Wrestling, Worldwide Wrestling, and Wide World Wrestling all being just some of the monikers that JCP went through as brand names for specific shows, as it would be called any of these names on TV, radio, and even be printed on tickets. So if you were in the area back in the day and you saw a professional wrestling show that was named one of these, well, you probably saw a Jim Crockett show and didn't even know it. Moving forward to 1952, Jim Crockett would join the National Wrestling Alliance, and the territory would start going by Mid-Atlantic Wrestling as their primary advertised name. But the true moniker of Jim Crockett Promotions was still indeed intact. Then, in 1973, John Ringley was heading things up temporarily before Jim Crockett Jr., the oldest son, would officially be placed in charge with the Crockett family taking over. But one of the biggest contributions that Ringley made during his short time at the top was bringing in one of the best bookers of the time, George Scott. No, not that George Scott. Now, Scott was a professional wrestler himself, part of the duo known as the Flying Scots, but interestingly enough, despite being a tag team wrestler himself, Scott actually started pulling focus away from JCP's tag division, even though that's what they were most known for. Fans didn't take too well to this initially, but when Scott started bringing in top stars like Wahoo McDaniel, the Super Destroyer, and John Valentine, they eventually began to turn around. And Scott also brought in young talent too, with fresh faces such as Roddy Piper, Ricky Steamboat, and a young Ric Flair, just to name a few. But don't get me wrong, tag team wrestling was by no means abandoned at this time, it just wasn't a central focus as it once was, with them concentrating more on developing singles acts. Another alteration to JCP's tradition was that the company decided to change its filming schedule by consolidating all of their weekly traveling shows into just one night on Wednesday in Raleigh, North Carolina, and then simply just syndicating the shows throughout their territory. Eventually, they would change their filming location yet again. This time, it would be to WPCQ TV Studios in Charlotte, which was almost serendipitously once owned by Ted Turner, but we'll be getting more into him later on. And as far as their TV talent went, their programming featured a lot of big local stars hosting their programs, like Charlie Harville and Big Bill Ward. They were eventually replaced when the show became known as Mid-Atlantic Championship Sport, which was hosted by several different personalities, such as Les Thatcher, Dr. Tom Miller, and the man who would end up taking over for good, another one of Crockett Sr.'s sons, David Crockett, king of the wild frontier. But don't feel too bad for some of the previous hosts that I mentioned, as Bill Ward would go on to host a short-lived second show called East Coast Wrestling, and then another supplementary show called Wide World Wrestling would take that show's place, hosted by Ed Capral, followed by a series of other hosts, such as the previous mentioned names of Les Thatcher and Dr. Tom Miller, as well as newcomers Rich Landrum and Johnny Weaver. And the latter two would get to host a different show in 1978 called The Best of NWA Wrestling. Now, this show had an interesting format. It featured Weaver, who was still wrestling Wrestling at the time, having guest stars on the show to review matches in a coaching style format. And here, things would really start to pick up for the promotion, as the JCP was allowed to expand to West Virginia, Tennessee, and Savannah, Georgia, which was a big deal since the nearby Atlanta had always been considered a prime location for professional wrestling. But the good news didn't stop there either, as Crockett would continue to grow even further, moving into Ohio cities such as Cincinnati and Dayton. But the biggest acquisition came when Crockett gained a third of the company known as Maple Leaf Wrestling, which was owned by Frank Tunney, who was the uncle of WWF's eventual kayfabe president, Jack Tunney. Now, by gaining a major part of the OG MLW, Jim Crockett Promotions was now able to start airing in upstate New York, which is beginning to encroach upon McMahon country, but just keep all this in mind because we're definitely not done talking about MLW yet. After this, the company's growth would become even more apparent, when Crockett Jr. started consolidating some of the NWA Southern Territories and stopped promoting themselves as Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, and instead just started calling themselves the NWA flat out, even though the NWA was still a distinctly different entity. But apparently the alliance really didn't mind all that much since Jim Crockett Jr. was elected president of the NWA in 1980, with Ole Anderson of Georgia Championship Wrestling fame taking over as head booker for JCP. And the following year, Ole would end up booking for both promotions, which just goes to show the immense growth and success of Jim Crockett Jr. and Jim Crockett Promotions. However, all that was about to change. In 1983, Vince McMahon Sr. asked George Scott if he could please help his son Vincent Kennedy McMahon, who had just taken over the company that we would now know today as WWE. Scott agreed as him and Vince McMahon Sr. were friends. So from there, Scott went to Atlanta, and this was just in time to oversee WWF's acquisition of TBS's Saturday night time slot, which was previously occupied by Georgia Championship Wrestling, and this event would eventually become known as Black Saturday. Now, this whole ordeal really does deserve a bit more attention, but I'm just going to give you a quick overview for the purposes of this story. Here's the rundown. Vince McMahon Jr. wanted to expand WWF's reach across the entire nation, and GCW had a really juicy deal with Turner Broadcasting, airing a show called World Championship Wrestling. But if only Vince McMahon could get his hands on that deal, then he would have control over all nationally aired professional wrestling in America. But when he approached Ted Turner about buying the time slot, billionaire Ted just laughed in his face and said no. However, McMahon would not take no for an answer. So to counter this, Vinnie Mac decided to just go straight to the source, and he bought the stakes of 3 of GCW's owners, leaving Ole Anderson only holding a third of the company that Vince McMahon did, thus allowing Vince McMahon to swoop on into WCW's time slot. As a result, TBS created a brand new professional wrestling program in order to appease their fan base that wasn't so happy with WWF being on their TV. And for this new show, they decided to give it to a new, small, up-and-coming promotion called Championship Wrestling from Georgia. All this led to Vince McMahon's first major failure as an owner, leaving him no choice but to sell the time slot. However, he refused to sell it to Ted Turner, and instead sold it to Jim Crockett Jr. for $1 million. After this, and going back to Maple Leaf Wrestling, Jack Tunney was now in charge, and he would partner up with Vince McMahon, giving the WWF the Toronto territory. And because of this, along with this new thing called WrestleMania and a new star named Hulk Hogan, Crockett had to respond quickly if they were going to remain competitive. So in order to gain ground across the country, Crockett either had to partner up with other promotions, or he had to try and beat Vince McMahon at his own game and buy them. Which is exactly the plan of attack that Crockett did, joining forces with Championship Wrestling from Georgia, Jarrett Promotions, and the AWA in order to create Pro Wrestling USA, which unfortunately went under in January of 1986. Despite this, Crockett was still elected into his second term as NWA president, and this time around they were going to make one big last-ditch effort in order to gain total domination. Having already bought Vince McMahon's TBS time slot, Crockett brought back the old WCW show on Saturday nights, filmed at Ted Turner's Atlanta studios. This show, which was now being run by Crockett and JCP's head booker at the time, Dusty Rhodes, would become wildly successful. So much so that they were even able to create a brand new event called the Great American Bash. And then in Crockett's third term as president of the NWA, he was able to acquire even more turf, with Championship Wrestling from Florida, the heart of America's sports attractions, the St. Louis Wrestling Club, and Mid-South Wrestling, all now operating under the NWA banner. But all of this expansion came at a cost, as traveling expenses definitely aren't cheap. And to make matters worse, the gates for these events really weren't what Crockett had hoped for. And on top of that, another devastating blow came to the JCP on pay-per-view. In 1987, Vince McMahon was ready to crush his competition, so he decided to come up with a brand new pay-per-view event, Survivor Series, which was going to air on the exact same day as Starrcade. Now, Crockett didn't want to lose straight up to Vince McMahon in pay-per-view competition, so he decided to move Starrcade to earlier in the day. However, unbeknownst to him, Vince McMahon had an even more devastating plot in mind. McMahon threatened pay-per-view providers by saying that if they aired Starrcade, they wouldn't be allowed to air Survivor Series or the following year's WrestleMania. And since WWF was by far the bigger selling product, most companies decided to go with Vince. Now, of course, this took a huge toll on the pay-per-view buy rate of Starrcade, but the live attendance? Well, that didn't help much either, with the event being held in Chicago, which was an area that was not as familiar with Jim Crockett Promotions as their home base of the Carolinas was. And their OG territory was definitely upset about losing such a major event to another city. This problem would repeat itself with the Bunkhouse Stampede, which took place in New York State, with the live audience for this pay-per-view only being about 6,000 in attendance. And remember, this is about the size of a good house show for WWF at the time. And plus, this only worked to enrage original JCPW fans even more. Plus, the pay-per-view buy rate for the event was dramatically undercut when WWF decided to air on the same night and on basic cable the very first Royal Rumble. And what wasn't helping either was that even though Jim Crockett Jr. was the president of the entire National Wrestling Alliance, and all these promotions were still working under the NWA banner, Crockett was definitely still JCP at heart, with the NWA title being locked around the waist of Jim Crockett Promotions wrestler Ric Flair. Because as successful as a heel champion can be, it was going to take a major babyface in order to combat Hulkamania. Therefore, Crockett decided to start investing heavily upon a brand new top star, a young, handsome, charismatic wrestler to rival the popularity of Hulk Hogan and to finally take the title off of the dominant Ric Flair. That wrestler was Magnum TA. But unfortunately, Magnum TA would be involved in a car accident and he would never wrestle again. Plus, in another example of JCP favoritism backfiring, Crockett pushed his stars over talent from other promotions like the UWF. And some say that if Crockett just made better use of the talent that he had at his disposal from the different promotions that he was working with, then maybe they could have crafted more stars, which would definitely have been a good thing. And lastly, in another odd case of history repeating itself, Crockett was spending way more money than they could possibly afford, with the limousine riding and jet flying not being a work because it's exactly what Crockett provided to his top stars, along with throwing some lavish parties. And even worse still, when Crockett took on the UWF, they also inherited all the debt that the company had. So, with the cost of advertising and not paying to get the exposure necessary in all the areas that you were expanding into, undervaluing stars that could have helped elevate your company, failing to find a new top babyface megastar, undervaluing a lot of the talent that you did have, getting beat thoroughly in the pay-per-view market, as well as spending way more money than you possibly should have, it was no wonder that Jim Crockett Promotions would find itself on the verge of bankruptcy, leaving Jim Crockett Jr. no choice but to sell his company for $9 million to Ted Turner. Jim Crockett Promotions under Turner became World Championship Wrestling, the name of the old show, and Jim Crockett Jr. would stay on as a consultant and the Crockett family would maintain a minority interest. However, those who do not learn from history are destined to repeat it, with WCW's own aggressive spending being one of the reasons that eventually led to their own sale to Vince McMahon. Thank you so much for the support over on Patreon to Mangy Stray, Freehand, and The Reflection of Perfection. To get your own Patreon shout out, please sign up on my Patreon page. The Sunshine State is known for many things. Oranges, beaches, sunshine, but also great professional wrestling, as it was home to one legendary promotion that changed the entire industry for the better. Not only did it feature some tremendous talents like Dusty Rhodes, Boris Malenkos, the Funks, the Briscoes, and of course the Grahams, but it also showed us just how great cross-promotion can really be. So, what is this promotion? How can it be so great? Well, that's the subject of this video, because this is the history of championship wrestling from Florida. Thank you to Cool Ass Jack and Inigo Montoya and all of my other Patreon supporters for all the help during these times. Before we get into the episode, allow me to ask that you make sure that you're a member of the Know-It-All Nation, because every subscriber helps me to get to my goal of getting that silver play button, which I feel like I'm way overdue for. And also, if you'd like to further support this channel, please go over and sign up on my Patreon page, as every little bit helps, and you also get your shout out, as well as access to bonus material, and you get to vote on the Patreon polls, because you should have a say on what goes on in this channel. Anyway, with all this being said, now, let's get into the video. Founded by the retired heel wrestler Cowboy Clarence Preston Luttrell, whose biggest claim to fame up until that point was competing in a boxing match against Jack Dempsey, although competing might be putting it nicely. Anyway, 9 years after that bout, and Cowboy Luttrell would open the Tampa, Florida wrestling office, which would soon become a member of the National Wrestling Alliance. In that same year, the state had just been hit by what was known simply as the Florida Hurricane, or the Delray Beach Hurricane, which caused around $50 million in damage. So, needless to say, this was an interesting time to start a business. However, Luttrell wasn't the sole owner of the promotion, as others were able to buy into it, like in 1961 when the promotion's best known owner, Luttrell's own protege, Eddie Graham, officially bought into the company before completely taking it over after Clarence had to step away a decade later in 1971. Now, Graham was born in 1930 in Dayton, Tennessee, and from birth he was only able to see out of one eye, but even with that, he had to sell eggs and newspapers as a child, coming from a troubled home life. Although there was an upside, because the newspaper that he worked for offered a YMCA gym membership to the newsies, where he began developing his training in physical fitness. Then, at the age of 17, he would begin wrestling after being trained by none other than Cowboy Luttrell himself. From there, Graham started out as an occasional kayfabe kin to Nature Boy Buddy Rogers named Rip Rogers, and no, not that Rip Rogers. From there, in 1958, after a loser leaves Texas match, he ended up changing his name to Eddie Graham. But now, instead of being Buddy Rogers' brother, he became a fictional family member to Dr. Jerry and Crazy Luke Graham, and eventually would be later on joined by that of Superstar Billy. Anyway, the Graham brothers did fairly well for themselves in Capitol Wrestling, the company now known as WWE. But we'll be getting more into them in just a little bit. Anyway, back to the matter at hand. In 1960, Eddie would leave his kayfabe kin in order to start wrestling in Florida. He would continue to wrestle there for a bit, even after completely taking over the CWF in 1971. He would eventually retire in 1977, only to return the following year. He would for real retire in 1982. Oh, and I would also like to bring up that with his troubles as a young man and with the YMCA membership being a very important part of his life, Eddie Graham knew just how important it was to give young people a place to go that will give them some direction. And together, Eddie Graham and Cowboy Luttrell would found the Florida Boys and Girls Ranch Villa, with every CWF show donating to the cause, with Graham paying it forward for all the help that he received as a kid. Returning to talking about the promotion, Championship Wrestling from Florida would call 106 North Albany Lane in Tampa home, as that was the location for their 7,500 square foot building that they called the Tampa Sportatorium, which was used on Thursdays at 11 a.m. for TV tapings that would air the following Sunday. Now, this was not a large arena by any stretch, as it allegedly held less than 100 people, and it had no air conditioning even though it was in Florida. But in order to make it appear larger, the room had all black walls, and upstairs there was the actual office for the Tampa Wrestling Office, where Eddie and his son Mike, along with Jim Barnett, would get all their office work done. Not only that, but there was also an on-site gym there as well. But while the building itself was small, it made up for it with the size of its wrestling and its stars, because during the good years under Graham, who himself would even get to serve 2 terms as NWA president, the company did extremely well, succeeding off of several strategies, not all of which were conventional for the time. One such tactic was the use of interpromotion, because while the show was immensely popular and did very well in its home state, it also did well in the New York market too, airing on a Spanish language channel in the area. Furthermore, Graham was also friends with Vince McMahon Sr., which opened the doors for a lot of talent exchanges and co-branded shows, such as the Super Bowl of Wrestling, which took place on January 25th, 1978, from the Orange Bowl Arena. Also, before this event actually happened, it was named in the movie The Wrestler, the 1970s one, not the Mickey Rourke one. This show featured the WWF stars taking on the stars from the CWF, with the main event featuring WWF World Champion Superstar Billy Graham going against NWA World Champion champion Harley Race. And the show did quite well, because with Championship Wrestling from Florida, presentation was everything. Not only was Championship Wrestling from Florida known for its great in-ring work, but it was also known for just how well they presented all of it, as the company was known just as much for its wrestling as it was for its star power. In the beginning, the CWF had a lot of success with the likes of Lou Thesz and Gene Kiniski, not to mention Eddie Graham himself along with his work with Sam Steamboat. And while there was also plenty of other stars in the promotion, too many to name, we do absolutely just have to bring up the vocal stylings of the legendary commentator and star in his own right, Gordon Solie. However, as time went on, a new star would emerge who would become the face of the franchise. And of course, this man was none other than the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. However, Rhodes actually started off as a heel. It wasn't until the mid-70s when Pak Song and manager Gary Hart turned on Dusty during a match with Eddie and Mike Graham that the American Dream would turn babyface. He would then become a working-class hero and a solo star, resonating with fans and becoming more over than anybody ever thought possible. He was so over, in fact, that Graham would occasionally have him leave the promotion to work elsewhere, like for Vince Sr., just so someone else had a chance of getting over in the CWF. But of course, Dusty's fame worked to get others over too, mainly heels, as many a bad guy or would-be heel would seek out working with Rhodes just in order to make a name for themselves. That's right, the American Dream was so popular that there were wrestlers who were willing to turn heel just because they would get more over Breaking Bad on Dusty than they ever could being a face on their own. And one such talent would wind up becoming Dusty's greatest rival. Of course, I'm talking about the Nature Boy Ric Flair, who originally wanted to be a carbon copy of Dusty, that is, until Dusty told him to find his own way and be his own man, to which Flair took that to mean just rip off Buddy Rogers instead. But hey, it worked. These were the golden years for Championship Wrestling from Florida, at least for a while. But things wouldn't stay solvent forever. Despite the popularity that the wrestling was receiving, the company was facing financial hardship, leading to Eddie Graham succumbing to a combination of both his business and personal issues in 1985, much of which had to do with concerns outside of that of pro wrestling. The company was left in the hands of other owners, primarily Hiro Matsuda and Duke Kiyomuka, but this changeover did not do any favors for the company, as just 2 years later, Jim Crockett Promotions would acquire them in February of 1987, with many of the top acts already working for them, or more likely, working for Vince McMahon Jr. The Grahams sold the Sportatorium just a few years later, and it would become a textile factory for years, until it was auctioned off in 2016. It would be purchased in 2020 by a developmental group. Things for the Graham family would only get worse, but there were still some positives left for the company that used to be known as Championship Wrestling from Florida. In 2003, a revival was created that served as part of the NWA before leaving in 2012 when it continued as an independent promotion. Furthermore, in 2006, the tape library would be purchased by WWE for use in their Dusty Rhodes DVD collection. The following June, a promotion modeled after the CWF called Florida Championship Wrestling was created, that quickly replaced Deep South Wrestling as the second developmental territory for WWE. By 2008, it had become the only developmental promotion for World Wrestling Entertainment. FCW became the proving ground for such talents such as Daniel Bryan, Bray Wyatt, Dean Ambrose, Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins, and many more. And then in 2012, FCW would be rebranded to the name it's now known by today, NXT. A big thank you to my awesome supporters over on Patreon like Middle Kingdom Wrestling and Dakari Garmin. Thank you so much, and to get your own Patreon shout out, please sign up over on my Patreon page. Once upon a time, there was a promotion that went from running just 3 states to the entire middle of the South to the whole universe, defying the NWA and creating a style of professional wrestling booking that would change the industry forever, as well as being home to such stars as Ted DiBiase, the Junkyard Dog, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Butch Reed, and of course, Jake Roberts. And they managed to do all this while keeping it totally kayfabe. They went from being a small overlooked territory to a complete overnight success. However, they went away almost just as fast. So, how could this happen? What promotion is this? Well, you're about to find out, because this is the history of Mid-South Wrestling. A big thank you to all of my Patreon supporters, such as Edgar Perez and Bob86. Thank all of you so much. Originally a territory under the National Wrestling Alliance, Mid-South Wrestling used to be known as NWA Tri-State, with Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Mississippi being the 3 states in question. Things all changed when wrestler Leroy McGurk began working for promoter Sam Avery, the man behind creating the pro wrestling scene in Tulsa. McGurk would go on to be credited as the longest reigning male singles champion of all time, with the reign as the National Wrestling Association's junior heavyweight champion that lasted around 10 years, although the exact number of days has been disputed, especially since after vacating the title, McGurk was still billed in some areas as being the champ. Either way, the title was eventually merged with the National Wrestling Alliance's version, unifying the two. But regardless as to pinpointing the actual day when McGurk stopped being champion, we know it wasn't after 1950, as that was the year that his career came to end after he was left unable to see as the result of a car accident. However, Sam Avery did keep McGurk on board, but now as his partner. From here, Leroy would eventually become vice president of the NWA, and throughout the 50s, McGurk did an amazing job as a pro wrestling booker, promoter, and overall mind for the industry. Between having to deal with the real-life conflict between Mildred Burke and her ex-husband Billy Wolf, to training young and up-and-coming wrestlers on top of his promotional duties, to even serving as the primary booker of his old title, the Junior Heavyweight Championship, Leroy McGurk proved to be one of the major behind-the-scenes players in all of wrestling. And so, when Avery retired in 1958, naturally, Leroy would be left in charge. And at this point, the promotion had grown to cover most of Oklahoma and Arkansas, with reach extending to parts of Missouri, Louisiana, and Texas. Too bad that despite this, the territory was still deemed as non-essential by the Alliance, and therefore the NWA World Champion would barely make appearances for them. This was a problem. Being under the NWA banner, every promotion within had to bow down to the one NWA World Champion, and by not getting regular visits from the top dog, it prevented you from getting as much money as you possibly could if you could promote having a world title. So what to do about this? Well, enter Bill Watts. One of Tri-State's biggest names was Cowboy Bill Watts, who wrestled there off and on again throughout the 60s and 70s. Early on, McGurk voted for Watts to become NWA champion, to no avail. Watts also got a chance to wrestle against Bruno Sammartino for the WWF World Championship, also to no avail. But where Watts found his biggest success would have to be backstage. McGurk brought on Watts as one of his key matchmakers, and the two would continue to work together, promoting a show at the Louisiana Superdome that drew around 31,000 fans in attendance, proving that the NWA highly underestimated the area. Sadly, Watts and McGurk would eventually begin to drift apart, with Watts continuing to promote from his home base in Louisiana and forging collaborative efforts with other promoters, such as Eddie Graham, Fritz Von Erich, and even Vince McMahon Sr. Then, after failing to pay several wrestlers, McGurk would end up selling what was left of his promotion to Bill Watts, who had now gained control over the entire Oklahoma territory. Watts renamed the promotion Mid-South Wrestling, and he promptly withdrew from the National Wrestling Alliance, although despite that, he still somehow was able to get regular visits from the NWA World Champion, which of course helped Mid-South to attract bigger crowds on a regular basis. Plus, what might be Watts' biggest contribution to the industry might just be his booking style, which is legendary for several reasons. First, Watts is credited with creating the episodic storyline method of booking. For you see, a lot like the independents today, back then, wrestling didn't have the week-to-week stories that we're all used to now, as both the indies and the territories didn't bank on the guarantee that talent and or fans would be there for every show, which was now expanding its reach and making watching wrestling even more available on a consistent basis, and Watts knew just how to take advantage of that. So, as is the case with bingeable streaming television or with soap operas, having storylines that thread through week to week that leave the audience eager to see what happens next was something that was completely overdue to join professional wrestling. Bill Watts was the genius to finally pair both of these things up. Promoters need to understand what the demographic wants and give it to them. Now, while we all take this kind of storytelling for granted today, and a lot of younger fans probably just assume that it was Vince McMahon who started it, make no mistake, it was Bill Watts who pioneered this technique. And while he did get people hooked with episodic TV, Watts still never succumbed to the cartoonish nature of the WWF, as he used this type of storytelling coupled with serious, realistic action. Mid-South's ring work focused on treating professional wrestling like it was indeed a legit sport, and they also believed in heavily protecting kayfabe, keeping separate locker rooms for both heels and faces, with the two groups not allowed to fraternize even outside of work, especially if two wrestlers were in a feud, and if you were caught doing so in public, well, there would be heavy consequences to say the least. In our era, people really believed that these two guys hated each other. We simply protected their belief. Some fans really just want to believe that there is legit animosity between some wrestlers in the business. For example, have you ever even suggested the possibility that Jim Cornette hating Kenny Omega might just be a work? Well, I have, and in my experience, I found—
Are you an idiot? Omega represents everything Cornette hates in the industry.
Please, nobody is that good of an actor. Not everything is a work, you know. You might as well go ahead and get your tinfoil hat.
Ah, the head voices. It's been a while, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, we just got vaccinated.
Ah, I see. Anyway, my point is, whether or not it's true, there are some feuds that fans really just want to believe in. So much so that they're willing to argue with anyone that even suggests that it might not be real. And Bill Watts just knew how to exploit that within us. Also, unsurprisingly, Watts hated smart fans and anyone who thought they knew what was going to happen. So, in order to counter this, Watts would take some extreme measures. For example, have you ever heard people say that it's tradition to go out on your back when you leave a company? Well, if word got out that a wrestler was leaving Mid-South and that he was going to be doing the favors on the way out, Watts would book him to go over instead, because protecting kayfabe was more important than just getting one single guy over. So the next time someone tells you that Kurt Angle just had to lose to Baron Corbin because he had to go out on his back and it was his last match, well, you could tell them Bill Watts might just disagree with that. And who are they to argue with Bill Watts? And also, I already dispelled the whole wrestlers have to go out on their back thing in a previous video. It's just another one of those adages that people think is true about wrestling, even though it definitely isn't. Furthermore, there was one other major component to Watts' style of booking, and that was stacking the card. For every big event, Watts would stick at least 3 major main event quality bouts on the show, which was just indicative of the amount of talent he had on his roster. Again, prior to this, talent would move around a lot, as having just a few main event guys was considered all you needed, as well as just having one major bout in order to close a show. However, Bill Watts thought otherwise, as having a mega roster or a stacked card was seen as something you could use to draw in fans. And so the next time someone tells you that the brand split is necessary, again, ask them who are they to argue with Bill Watts. We made a name for ourselves by stacking cards, so there were about 2 or 3 main events on every card, and it was successful. And by now, I think you might notice that a lot of this sounds pretty familiar to what WWE has always done. At least, now you know where it all came from. Speaking of which, the promotion had many stars, too many to name them all right here, but a multitude of them would go on to be yet something else that Vince McMahon would capitalize on that originally came from Mid-South. In the end, Vince would get the last laugh. As he took to WWF and went national, a lot of other territories felt the need to do the same. And as the territory system came to a close, Watts' last attempt to go national happened in March of 1986, when he took the company, relaunched it, and changed its name. As Mid-South was seen as too regional sounding of a name for a national product, so Watts renamed the promotion the Universal Wrestling Federation. Take that, WWF. Alas, it was not meant to be, as a little over a year later, and Watts sold the company to Jim Crockett Promotions, which later became WCW. He decided to get out while he still could and on his terms, selling the promotion and getting something out of it, while others would put everything on the line just trying to keep theirs afloat, even though it was plainly inevitable what was going to happen. Unfortunately though, Cowboy Bill never trademarked the name, and Herb Abrams would take it to create a UWF of his very own that ran from 1990 to 1996. Leroy McGurk's daughter, Mike McGurk, would go on to become an announcer for WWF. Cowboy Bill Watts, on the other hand, would go on to become executive vice president of WCW, as well as a booker for WWE. A quick shout out to all my awesome Patreons like True Sinister and Rodney Harris. Thank you so much for the support, and if you want your own Patreon shout out, please go over and sign up on my Patreon page. The whole day through, just an old sweet song. For many old school fans, wrestling in the South means one promotion and one promotion above all others. And seeing that it's a major component of what would be WCW, I say a lot of fans even today owe a lot to this once great company. But how did it rise? How did it fall? Well, I've got Georgia on my mind, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about here today, because this is the history of Georgia Championship Wrestling. Thank you so much for the amazing support over on Patreon, Ron Hawthorne. To get your own Patreon shout out, sign up over on my Patreon page. Before we continue with the video, allow me to ask that you please make sure that you're a member of the Know-It-All Nation and that you're subscribed to this very channel. Now that we've said that, let's get back into the episode. Created in Atlanta just several years before the National Wrestling Alliance, Georgia Championship Wrestling was originally known as ABC Booking. It was founded by Paul Jones, a retired wrestler who was born Andrew Lutzy, not to be confused with Paul Frederick, a much younger wrestler who also went by the same name. Despite being created before the Alliance, ABC Booking still regularly hosted the NWA champion, all the while making sure to maintain their own sense of identity as well as promoting their own championships, with the Georgia Heavyweight title being particularly noteworthy. The exact start date of the title is unknown, with some claiming that it was created in the 1950s, but there are other reports stating that it goes as far back as the 1930s. What we do know for sure is that the belt first started gaining prominence in February of 1963, with such stars holding the belt in the beginning as Choo Choo Lin, Don Fargo, and most of all, El Mongol, who would win the title an impressive 10 times. The championship is still around even to this day, thanks especially to the revival of GCW, and no, I'm not talking about Game Changer Wrestling, but you'll have to wait to the end of the video to find out more about that. Now, this wasn't the only belt to matter in Georgia at the time, as their tag division was quite hot too. The tag titles were primarily highlighted starting in the 1960s, with the Vachons being the first major stars to hold them, although they would have to make way for the Assassins, Jody Hamilton and Tom Renesto, who would get to hold the tag titles 10 times themselves. Paul Jones would run the company for 30 years before stepping away from operations. However, he still retained some ownership of the promotion. Although, starting in the early 70s, Ray Gunko, Paul's assistant, was already helping out so much so that things pretty much ran under him from that point on. But the 1970s was a turning point for the promotion for other reasons as well, because on Christmas Day 1971, the company would make its television debut. This Christmas special was followed by a regular ongoing television series hosted by Ed Capral, which was called Big Time Wrestling. Not to be confused with all the other promotions calling themselves by the same name. Man, a lot of confusion in this episode already. The show began running on WQXI-TV in Atlanta, Georgia, but it was also taped and sent to Savannah and Augusta as well. Now originally, during the start of the promotion, matches would take place in Atlanta's Municipal Auditorium on Fridays, but in 1972, the company would go through a bit of an overhaul, switching venues to the brand new Omni Coliseum, and then switching television stations to a little independent UHF station called WTCG. You might know it better for its owner at the time, Ted Turner, and by its current name, TBS. Unfortunately, Ray's time in charge would not last very long. His wife figured she would get control of the company and was surprised that it didn't happen. The promotion was instead sold out from under her to Bill Watts and was renamed Mid-South Sports, which is different from Mid-South Wrestling, and yes, I already did a video about that as well. Anyway, feeling like she was wronged, Ann Gunko created her own promotion called the All-South Wrestling Alliance, an outlaw promotion that competed against Mid-South Sports and operated outside of the NWA. During this time, a lot of talent would join Ann's company, such as then tag team champions Dick Steinborn and Argentina Apollo, who would leave and just abandon their championships. And to add to this, All-South would get Mid-South's TV time slot. Although they would still remain on the same channel, they were just moved to a different time. Now naturally, this was seen as something of a problem for Bill Watts, who clearly underestimated his competition, and so he decided to turn to an expert, Jim Barnett, a man who had promoted all over from Michigan to Ohio to even Australia, and his promotion down under just happened to be named World Championship Wrestling. Not the one you're thinking of, at least not yet. Now, after a decade, he would sell his Australian promotion and return home to the United States, where he would become one of the owners of Georgia Championship Wrestling. And thanks to Jim, Ann's All-South promotion took an immediate nosedive, getting locked out of arena dates and having talent jump back to her competition. And as a result, and after only 2 short years, the All-South Wrestling Alliance would close its doors, with Mid-South Sports officially winning the war. In 1976, WTCG would become distributed via satellite, and Mid-South Sports was renamed to Georgia Championship Wrestling. The show was hosted by the legendary Gordon Soley and was filmed in Atlanta out of a small studio on Peachtree Street. Their flagship show would air on Saturday nights with a supplementary show on Sundays, and it was also a major part of what kept this new Superstation afloat during its initial run. Georgia Championship Wrestling became must-see TV for fans in the area, but it also became widely important for wrestlers all across the country, as talent from everywhere started to hear that Georgia was the place to be if you wanted to get paid and you wanted to get over. Now, there are too many stars to name, but such major acts for the promotion included 12-time Georgia Heavyweight Champion Mr. Wrestling 2, the Masked Superstar, the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, the Freebirds, and of course, the Briscoe brothers. And again, no, not the ones you're thinking of. I'm talking about Jerry and Jack Briscoe, but we'll be getting more into them in just a little bit. Now, as good as all this was for the promotion, it was beginning to cause something of a problem for certain people. Seeing that GCW was aired via satellite, it does mean that technically speaking, it was the first NWA show to air on a national level. Now, I know we take it for granted today, but once upon a time, the idea of a wrestling program being available to watch all across the entire country was quite a big deal. And it was also seen as something of a potential issue for those in the NWA. Considering that GCW was merely one part of the National Wrestling Alliance, it raised some concerns that perhaps the company was growing too big for its britches, with the belief that an NWA affiliate could not and should not go national, although there is a difference between airing nationally and being a national promotion. Whatever the case, the debate still rages on, and we're no close to getting an answer as to what the real plans really are now than we were back then. Either way, all we know for sure is that this is just about as far as the company was ever going to go. In 1982, the show Georgia Championship Wrestling was renamed yet again, this time to World Championship Wrestling. I guess Barnett really liked the name. And they were beginning to expand into Jim's old stomping grounds of Ohio and Michigan. However, the following year in 1983, Barnett would end up getting backdoored into having to sell most of his shares to a conglomerate of wrestlers, which included Jerry and Jack Briscoe as well as Ole Anderson. This would ultimately lead to the promotion's downfall. Enter Vince McMahon. As previously covered numerous times on this channel, Vince McMahon had begun expanding his promotion, the WWF, and was seeking to solidify that by gaining as much national airtime as possible. He already had shows on the USA Network, but he felt that wasn't enough. Vince wanted a second national cable show in order to guarantee his success. However, rather than starting from scratch, McMahon figured it'd be easier to just buy a show that already was being aired all across the country. The only hiccup was that there was only one option, GCW on WTBS, and their fan base of hardcore athletic Georgia-style wrestling was very different from what the WWF was offering. But even though the bonds between the fans and the product were very strong, it was the bonds backstage that were not. Even though the Briscoes were the major stakeholders in the company, Ole served as head booker and worked his way into becoming the de facto head of operations. Meanwhile, Vince had tried repeatedly to get TBS owner Ted Turner to sell him GCW's Saturday night time slot, but Turner wouldn't budge, and so, not knowing how to quit, Vince McMahon figured that if Turner wouldn't sell GCW's time slot, maybe he should just go through GCW itself. Despite not owning the biggest portion of the company, Ole Anderson was the man in charge, even being trusted for a period of time to book for both GCW and Jim Crockett promotions, sometimes even simultaneously. Eventually, Ole would leave JCP in order to focus 100% of his attention on Georgia Championship Wrestling, although he couldn't have picked a worse time. As all this was going on, the majority shareholders, the Briscoe brothers, along with Jim Barnett, who was still there with his remaining shares, were growing increasingly dissatisfied with Ole Anderson and his total control. Smelling blood in the water due to the dissension in the ranks, Vince McMahon swooped on in and made an offer to Jim Barnett in order to buy his shares. What Barnett didn't realize is that McMahon had also made the same deal with Jerry and Jack Briscoe. This would result in Paul Jones, who still had some stake in the company, having to follow suit, seeing the writing on the wall. And thus, Vince McMahon would become the majority shareholder of Georgia Championship Wrestling. Following this, many GCW personnel were either released or resigned, including Gordon Solie, and many fans were stunned to see Vince McMahon on their television screens telling them that their beloved GCW was now being replaced by WWF on an episode which has now become known as Black Saturday. Now, at first, McMahon promised original programming for the TBS show. That didn't happen right away, as they first began airing clips from the USA show as well as featuring content from the likes of Madison Square Garden. Nothing from Georgia. Then, nearly a year later, in March of 1985, WWF would begin finally making use of the TBS studios, and they would change the name of the show to WWF Georgia Championship Wrestling. Although, while it did make use of the facility and it did host some original matches, the show was mostly a means to promote WrestleMania. Now, not surprisingly, this would cause the ratings to plummet, with armies of fans irate with the change, leaving Ted Turner to have to right the ship. Uncle Ted went to Bill Watts, who is now running a promotion called Mid-South Wrestling, and he would offer him a time slot on Sunday. He would offer yet another time slot on Saturday mornings to Ole Anderson, who went from running Georgia Championship Wrestling to running Championship Wrestling from Georgia. See, it's different. It's not the same. Anyway, McMahon was furious about this, especially with both of these new shows doing better in the ratings. So now Vince had to react, and he did so by going to Jim Barnett, who, along with the Briscoes, were given jobs with the WWF. Barnett would become the go-between for Vince and Jim Crockett Jr., who at the time were rivals, as Crockett was trying to counteract everything that WWF was doing. Nevertheless, a deal was made, and Crockett would pay $1 million to buy Vince McMahon's World Championship Wrestling, which he in turn would sell to Ted Turner, and Turner would take all of it and create his very own promotion called WCW, which in 2001 would be sold right back to Vince McMahon. Barnett would go on to become VP of Titan Sports before working for Jim Crockett Promotions in 1987, staying there through the transition to WCW as a senior advisor. He would later return to WWE following the sale in 2001. As for Jack Briscoe, he would join the WWF after the deal with Vince McMahon, but he would step away from the business entirely in 1985, disenfranchised with the direction of pro wrestling. His brother Jerry would stay with McMahon, even being featured as a stooge during the Attitude Era. He would be furloughed and released in 2020. And as for Ole Anderson, he would swear revenge against all parties. And not surprisingly, Ole was not included amongst the rest of the Horsemen during their induction into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2012. As for today, the rights to promote under the Georgia Championship Wrestling banner have been acquired numerous times, starting in the 1990s with Grady. Thank you so much for the support over on Patreon to Inigo Montoya and Ron Hawthorne. To get your own Patreon shout out, please go over and sign up on my Patreon page. If there was ever one pivotal time period for all of professional wrestling, it would absolutely have to be the 1980s. And one of the most major components of that totally was the WWF. The industry would never be the same as a result of Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation. How so exactly? Well, that's the subject of this episode, because today... we take so much for granted about how professional wrestling works that it's hard to remember or even imagine a time before wrestling was what it came to be. The schedule of major pay-per-view events, massive amount of merchandise sales, and national television were all brought to unseen levels thanks to Vince McMahon. And while the company that we would all know now as the WWE did begin long before Vince and Kennedy McMahon ever took it over, today we'll be focusing on the WWF portion of this promotion, as I've already covered some of WWE's early history as the Capital Wrestling Corporation and as the WWF in a prior video, but also because the awesome supporters over on Patreon voted to see a video about the 80s. And what could possibly be more 80s than the Rockin' Wrestling WWF? Oh, and since we're on the subject, I do want to take this time to give a big thank you to my supporters over on Patreon, such as Andy Savardi, Baba Yaga, and Rick Rack. Thank you to everyone for all the help. Our story begins on February 21st, 1980, when Vincent Kennedy McMahon Jr. and his wife Linda officially incorporated the company known as Titan Sports in South Yarmouth, Massachusetts. This followed the rebranding of Vincent James McMahon Sr.'s promotion, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, being simplified for marketing purposes to simply become the World Wrestling Federation. Titan Sports would also apply to trademark WWF at this time as well. And we all know how that would eventually work out. Now, back then, the WWF was part of a parent company known as Capital Sports, and it was also a part of the National Wrestling Alliance. That's right. Okay, so I'm sure some of you are wondering to yourself, didn't Vince McMahon Sr. withdraw from the NWA back in 1963? Well, he did, before quietly rejoining again in 1971. And just to refresh, the NWA was an umbrella organization with other promotions working under it. Or better yet, as Vince McMahon once put it in an interview with Sports Illustrated, in the old days there were wrestling fiefdoms all over the country, each with its own little lord in charge. Each little lord respected the rights of his neighboring little lord, no takeovers or raids were ever allowed. There were maybe 30 of these tiny kingdoms in the US, and if I hadn't bought out my dad, there would still be 30 of them, fragmented and struggling. I, of course, had no allegiance to those little lords. So now, the stage was set. Roughly 2 years after incorporating incorporating the company, Vince McMahon would buy Capital Sports from his father and the other associates of the company, Gorilla Monsoon, Phil Zacco, and Arnold Scanlon. However, this wasn't a straight acquisition. Vince Jr. had to pay on a monthly basis, and if he even missed one single payment, ownership would completely revert back. So the younger McMahon took out loans and made deals with other figures in the business with the goal of fully owning the WWF by the summer of 1983. This strategy proved to be successful, with Vincent Kennedy McMahon repeating what his father did 20 years earlier and withdrawing from the National Wrestling Alliance. This happened during the NWA's annual meeting in 1983. So now, no longer bound by the restrictions of the NWA, not that that stopped them all that much to begin with, Vince was now completely free to compete with all the other promotions in the country all he wanted, in order to fulfill his dream of creating the premier wrestling company in America and one day, the entire world. Now, in order to defeat his competition, Vince McMahon would need an army. And that's exactly what he got. He reinvested much of the income of Titan Sports into talent, many of which he acquired from other promotions in the NWA, which eventually led to some of them going out of business. But without a doubt, the biggest masterstroke of Vince McMahon's acquisition game would have to be the signing of a particular AWA wrestler who was coming fresh off an appearance in the hit film Rocky III. Of course, that wrestler was none other than Hulk Hogan. Hogan had previously worked for Vince McMahon Sr., who was opposed to him appearing in Rocky III. However, despite the disapproval from Vinnie Mac Prime, Jr. saw the potential in Hogan and chose the Hulkster as the centerpiece for his grand vision, and Hogan would end up winning the WWF World title the following January. Now, with Vince having his soldiers line up, he would start pushing into enemy territory, expanding touring and selling videotapes outside of the Northeast. However, if he was really going to score as a national wrestling promotion, Vince knew that he would have to have WWF TV on in as many American homes as possible. So, McMahon began his plan to do just that. He purchased Southwest Championship Wrestling's time slot on a station called the USA Network, and he replaced it with his own show called All American Wrestling. He also created the nationally syndicated programs WWF All-Star Wrestling and WWF Championship Wrestling, as well as premiering the show Tuesday Night Titans. But this wasn't enough for Vince, as he felt that in order to really control nationwide wrestling television, he would have to sign just one more nationwide cable deal. Unfortunately, the only one available belonged to Georgia Championship Wrestling on TBS, the Superstation. This all led to Black Saturday, which I already talked about during my video for Jim Crockett Promotions that you can check out after this one. Although, just to quickly recap, Vince McMahon acquired the majority of GCW and replaced their show with his. The fans of GCW instantly rejected the flashy gimmicks and family-friendly programming of the WWF, as they much preferred their Southern-style wrestling. However, this wasn't Vince's only iron in the fire, as he had also struck a deal with another network, a new channel that was growing quite popular with the youth, a little channel known as MTV, to form what was known as the Rock and Wrestling Connection. This started when Captain Lou Albano met singer Cyndi Lauper while on a trip to Puerto Rico. She asked him to play her father in her music video for Girls Just Want to Have Fun back in 1983, the success of which was not lost on Vince McMahon. And so, just little over a week after Black Saturday, MTV aired The Brawl to End It All, a WWF event that culminated a storyline that had been crafted between Albano and Lauper, airing just one match that saw Wendy Richter, accompanied by Cyndi Lauper, defeating the Fabulous Moolah as managed by Captain Lou Albano. This event did really well and helped to expose WWF to a brand new audience. And this led to another show on MTV called The War to Settle the Score on February 18th, 1985. This time around, Roddy Piper attacked both Lou Albano and Cyndi Lauper as a result of being sick of the whole rock and wrestling thing, only to have Hulk Hogan come to their defense. As a result, the show would see champion Hulk Hogan go one-on-one with Roddy Piper with the WWF title on the line. The match ended in disqualification when Paul Orndorff interfered with the bout. Meanwhile, Hulk Hogan's friend Mr. T was sitting ringside and was also attacked after entering the ring at the end of the match. This set up the main event for the WWF's next major show, which was also Vince McMahon's biggest gamble of all time: WrestleMania. For you see, even though TBS didn't work out, Vince McMahon's deal with USA was still going strong, and the deal with MTV was a huge success. But even though WWF was making good money, it had to make even more.
Life is good. but it can be better.
Vince McMahon wanted to tour in more cities and on more dates across the country. Only problem is that kind of travel schedule required a lot of capital. So Vince McMahon gambled everything on one huge supercard event, and he would make this show different from other supercards that had come before by heavily focusing on the entertainment side of the equation.
We're in the sports entertainment business, and there is a huge philosophical difference.
Vince McMahon followed the success of the rock and wrestling experience by featuring celebrities as the backdrop to the wrestling event, investing a lot in acquiring outside stars like Liberace, the Rockettes, and Muhammad Ali, not to mention the aforementioned Cyndi Lauper and Mr. T. Oh, and also a last-minute appearance on Saturday Night Live didn't hurt either. And as it turned out, WrestleMania was a tremendous success, becoming an annual tradition, with WrestleMania 3, headlined by Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant, being an even bigger triumph, leading to the creation of even more pay-per-views and WWF being solidified as the national wrestling promotion and eventually the global company that Vince McMahon had always dreamed that it could be. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and make sure that you're subscribed. I want to give a big thank you to all my awesome Patreon supporters out there, and I want to thank you for watching. And as always, Dave knows.